Now that the other side also has the atomic bomb, all of a sudden, life got very scary. There was, in fact, a ratcheting up of paranoia about one of those horrible bombs falling from the sky on America. And in order to help alleviate people's fears, the Federal Civil Defense Administration started releasing public service announcements like this one featuring their mascot, Bert the Turtle.
Deedle-dum-dum, deedle-dum-dum, deedle-dum-dum. There was a turtle by the name of Bert, and the turtle was very alert. When danger threatened him, he never got hurt. He knew just what to do. He ducked and covered, ducked and covered. He did what we all must learn to do. You and you and you and you, duck and cover.
You'll notice that this is essentially the same thing as a tornado drill. And you may be asking yourself, well, that's all fine if there's plaster falling because of an earthquake or a tornado, but how is this going to help you in the event of nuclear annihilation? And of course, it would not. My favorite such public service announcement is from 1954. It was called The House in the Middle. It was a 12-minute film, and it basically the idea was that there's this experiment they did, right? They were going to explode anyhow as an experiment, a nuclear bomb in the deserts of New Mexico, and about 1 mile from the ground zero of the blast site, they had placed these 3 little houses, really not much more than big sheds. And the houses on the left and the right, according to the PSA, the houses on the left and the right were not properly equipped to survive a nuclear Armageddon. But the house in the middle, just maybe, was. So let's take a look at the reasoning that the house in the middle was so special. The first experiment they show has 2 houses, both of them freshly painted and very neat on the outside. But on the inside, one house is very straight, neat, and orderly, but the other one, well, you can see the pictures. Dear God, look at that. Cluttered tables, coats not hung up, newspapers left lying out there, all these combustible items. And then when the nuclear blast happens a mile away, the house that's neat inside has some minor damage on the exterior, but the one that's all cluttered up with this combustible stuff erupts into fire from the intense heat and burns the house down. Then the next experiment that they show has 3 houses. The house in the middle is freshly painted and everything is neat and tidy inside, and the lawn is mowed. The house on the left needs a paint job really bad, and there's a bunch of crap out in the yard. And then the house on the far right is freshly painted, but the lawn's not mowed and it's messy inside. And it's the house in the middle, and that one, that survives. So here's the message, basically. Guys, if you would get out there and paint the dadgum house and mow the yard like you're supposed to, and ladies, if you wouldn't be such a slob and you would pick up the papers and crap around the house, why, you'd be a lot more likely to survive a nuclear Armageddon. Now, is that actually true? No, that's not true. It doesn't, I mean, how much does it matter anyway? Because all these houses are 1 mile from the blast site. So in New Mexico, there wouldn't be many houses like that anyway. It's really a way of kind of like the duck and cover thing, hide under the desk if an atomic bomb falls, to make people feel like the government is giving them a way to protect themselves and there's something they can do. Although in reality, all of it's really pretty pointless and meaningless. By the way, that film was produced with the cooperation of the Federal Civil Defense Administration, but that's not who actually produced it. They cooperated. It was actually produced by the National Clean Up, Paint Up, Fix Up Bureau, which is not a thing that existed. It was actually the National Association of Paint and Lacquer. So it was a professional organization that was trying to get people to buy more paint. And they called themselves a bureau to make it sound like they were a government office, and they got the approval of the Civil Defense Administration to produce this video, which, kind of goes to show that you should read the fine print. With the increased paranoia of the atomic age came increased paranoia bordering on hysteria about communist spies, communist sympathizers, and so forth. Reds, since red was the color associated with the Soviet revolutionaries in World War I, and another term that started to develop, someone who's not a red, maybe they're not a member of the Communist Party, but they're a sympathizer, so they're not quite red, they're pinkos. That term would linger around for a long time afterward. So there was this fear that, it got expressed in a lot of different ways. And one of the things that immediately came to the fore was suspicion of Hollywood, because so many people in Hollywood, as the stereotype went, and it wasn't completely a stereotype, probably, more than half, certainly, of people in Hollywood were leaning more toward the left than the right, although that was not a universal thing. In 1945, Congress formed, actually the House of Representatives, the House Committee on Un-American Activities, which actually the acronym HUAC doesn't quite match up with the name, but it rolls off the tongue a little easier, I guess. Anyway, that committee would be in existence for 30 years. However, only about the first half of that time did they really have a lot of activity and a lot of power. They just kind of lingered on after 1960 for several years. So beginning in 1947, that House committee started investigations into people in Hollywood to see how many of them might be communist sympathizers. And in a lot of cases, and in some cases, there were people who were members of the Communist Party or who were members of the Socialist Party. In a lot of cases, these were folks who maybe 10 or 15 years earlier, maybe when they were in college, had attended some meetings of leftist groups. Didn't necessarily even join, but if they were in that company, they are now suspect. So people started being called before Congress to testify about their reading material, about the activities that they were engaged in, not only then, but when they were younger. And more importantly, they were asked to name names. Who do you know in the Hollywood community that might have sympathies toward the far left, might even have sympathies toward the Communist Party? Who do you know that might have been a member of some of these groups or even attended some of their meetings 15 years ago? Some actors, and when I say Hollywood people, these were actors, directors, writers, various people associated with the movie industry. And some of them stood up there and, in fact, named all the names they could think of. Others did not. In particular, in 1947, fall of 1947, there were 10 individuals that refused to answer the questions put to them about who they knew that might have these sympathies. They felt that was inappropriate and unconstitutional question to judge people based on what their opinion might be. So they were held in contempt of Congress for not answering the questions, and they were denied appeal. There were 10 of them altogether, 9 writers and 1 director, including the very famous writer, Dalton Trumbo. They were denied appeal, and they were all sentenced to 1 year in prison. Now, in the photograph, you see this is just part of a very long line of people in the movie industry that came during the hearings of these 10 people that came to protest outside the Capitol. They marched around. They're being led by a married couple, Humphrey Bogart and Lauren Bacall, who were 2 of the biggest stars in Hollywood at that time. They were in several movies together. Bogart is best known for his hard-bitten detective characters and for starring in Casablanca, one of the greatest movies ever made. Bacall just passed away, actually, a few years ago at a ripe old age. There was a great quote from that protest by actress Judy Garland, who's best known for playing Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz. She said, "Now, I've never been a member of any political organization, but I've been following this investigation, and I don't like it. There are a lot of stars here to speak to you. We're show business, yes, but we're also American citizens. It's one thing if someone says we're not good actors. That hurts, but we can take that. It's something else again to say we're not good Americans. We resent that." So those 10 people were held in contempt for not answering questions and were sent to prison for a year. A whole lot of other people who weren't held in contempt but may have been named by some of the people who did testify, some of their colleagues, and in some cases some of their friends, probably former friends after that, who were named as possibly having leftist sympathies. Many of them got blacklisted, which is to say that they were unofficially banned. It wasn't anything to do with laws or the government, but the studios refused to hire them, and they couldn't get work in their chosen profession. And this was actors, writers, and directors, but also musicians, technicians, anyone connected with the entertainment industry. And a whole lot of people endured that and weren't able to work for years afterward in the profession they had trained for. The House Un-American Activities Committee, or the House Committee on Un-American Activities, it works either way, did not just focus on the entertainment industry, though. In fact, 1948, they ensnared a high-ranking government diplomat, Alger Hiss. Alger Hiss had worked for the State Department and had also worked for the United Nations. In fact, he had been one of the people who helped draft the charter of the United Nations. And one of his colleagues, under oath before the committee, had said that Hiss was a former member of the Communist Party and accused him of actually espionage, spying for the Soviet Union, and that in fact that Hiss had passed to him some classified documents. Hiss was then brought up, put under oath, and said that none of that was true. He had never been a member of the Communist Party. He was not a spy. He had not passed the documents. However, one of the most prominent members of the committee, of the House Un-American Activities Committee at that time, a young Republican congressman from California named Richard Milhouse Nixon, there he is in the upper right, really came to national prominence during this whole thing. He really pressed hard against Hiss and called for further investigation. Turns out there was evidence that at one time Hiss had in fact been a member of the Communist Party. and that he had in fact passed some classified documents to this other guy. There was no direct evidence. It was never proven that he was actually a spy for the Soviets. And on the other hand, it was never proven that he wasn't. However, he was arrested for perjury, for having lied under oath about those other things, and wound up going to prison for 3.5 years. And this really started the trajectory into the public limelight for Richard Nixon. Now, a little bit after that, a few years after that, around 1949, 1950, there was another high-profile arrest. Well, it became high-profile. These were not people who were very highly placed in the government, like Alger Hiss. It was Julius Rosenberg and his wife Ethel. Julius Rosenberg was an engineer, and really their connection to all of this was that Ethel's brother, David, worked at Los Alamos, where the atomic bombs, were being made. And he was caught passing documents, nuclear secrets, to Julius Rosenberg, who was accused of being a Soviet spy. He was a past member of the Communist Party. And the story was that he had actually converted his brother-in-law, David, over to be a spy as well, and that had passed these atomic secrets that he received from his brother-in-law then to his Soviet handlers, and that his wife, Ethel, had helped him in this by typing up his notes and also receiving some of the material from her sister-in-law, David's wife. Well, David Greenglass took a plea deal. He turned state's evidence, he and his wife, against his sister and her husband, and was able to get a prison sentence. However, the Rosenbergs were convicted of treason and sentenced to death. Now, for a little context, you have to realize the timing. All this would have happened, this trading of secrets, a couple of years earlier. And then one day, 1949, pow, Russia has an atomic bomb. So, that's not a good chain of events. So they were sentenced to be executed. A lot of people in the U.S. were not entirely convinced of their guilt, or felt that the penalty was too severe, especially for Ethel. And there was also a lot of support among American allies in Europe for some kind of clemency. The Pope asked for clemency, but they were executed all the same in 1951. And, years later, when a lot of the information, classified information that came out of the Soviet Union was revealed after the fall of the Soviet Union, collapse of the Cold War, now we know that they were, in fact, guilty of what they'd been charged with. So it turns out there actually were some Soviet spies, and so that obviously is going to crank up the hysteria a few notches more. And that's where this guy comes in, Joseph McCarthy, who had the nickname Tail Gunner Joe from World War II. He had been a Army Air Corps tail gunner in a bomber. He was elected to the Senate from Wisconsin in 1946. And he was very anti-communist, which is not saying much because practically everyone either was or pretended to be, or, tried to avoid talking about it, whatever. So that in itself is not that unusual. But he really, he took it up a huge notch, particularly when he made the announcement in a speech in February of 1950 that he had a list of 205 members of the Communist Party and potential communist spies working in the State Department. And that got a lot of press. Not long after that, he wound up being put in charge of the Senate Committee of Government Operations, which gave him a platform to launch investigations into members of the government, accusing them of communism. And so he had that first list, 205 people working in the State Department. He later said he had a list of 130 Russian spies working in the defense industry. He also eventually got around to accusing high-ranking members of the Eisenhower administration and implying that President Eisenhower himself were Soviet sympathizers, that the Army, the U.S. Army, was just riddled with Russian spies and communist sympathizers claiming to have evidence for all this, which he always claimed to have the evidence, but he never actually showed the evidence because it was highly, highly classified. Just trust me, all these people are communists, essentially, he was saying. And it fanned the flames of the Red Scare, of the terror and of the hysteria, really sweeping across the country. And in fact, from 1950 to through 1953, McCarthy was one of the most powerful people in the United States because he was wielding all this power, he was making accusations against people, and people were afraid to cross him. They were afraid to get on his bad side because maybe they'd be the next ones to be accused of being a communist spy. And whether there was evidence or not didn't really seem to matter to McCarthy. And it didn't really seem to matter at first to the public either. He became very popular with probably the majority of people in the early 1950s in the U.S. In his activities of pursuing communists in the government or suspected or alleged communists, he was frequently aided by the guy with him in this picture in the top, Roy Cohn, who was his chief counsel, his lawyer, and according to ye old Wikipedia, his political fixer, who was really good at behind-the-scenes kind of machinations. Cohn would go on later in the 1970s to be the legal counsel and mentor, really, of Donald Trump, and would introduce Trump to one of his other close friends and clients, Rupert Murdoch. Things started to change in 1954, and to a large degree, that change, kind of the catalyst for it, was this guy, Edward R. Murrow, who was a journalist. He had, during World War II, because of his combat journalism, become one of the most respected journalists in America. And by 1954, he was the most respected journalist on television. And in March 1954, he put together a documentary, a 1-hour documentary about McCarthy that was very, very critical, that showed McCarthy making statements and then contradicting himself and claiming things and then proving that there was no evidence for them, and basically accusing McCarthy of stirring up witch hunts, which is a callback, to the Salem witch trials, when there was also a bit of mass hysteria that led to a lot of people being accused of witchcraft, usually, maybe in all cases, innocent of it, and killed as a result. So he made this documentary. CBS really were scared about this. They didn't want him to do it because they were afraid of angering McCarthy and his supporters. So they refused to give him any money to advertise. They refused to advertise it, and they refused to give him any money to advertise it. So he and his colleagues raised the money themselves to advertise this documentary to get people to tune in. And a lot of people did, and opinions started to shift about McCarthy. There was a really good movie about this, about Edward R. Murrow and the making of this documentary challenging McCarthy, that came out in 2005, called Good Night and Good Luck, which was Murrow's tagline at the end of every news broadcast. That's what he would say. This film was directed by George Clooney, who co-starred as Murrow's partner and co-producer, Fred Friendly. I highly recommend it. Things really came to a head just a month later, in April of 1954, when Senate hearings were held that were structured around McCarthy's accusations against the U.S. Army, that it was full of communists and that he could produce a list before the sun went down of 130 communists working for the Department of Defense, and so forth. So these hearings were held. They went on for 2 months. They were televised every day, and people were watching closely. McCarthy and his lawyer / assistant, Roy Cohn, were cross-examining witnesses. And on the other side was U.S. Army Chief Counsel Joseph Welch. Now, at one point, McCarthy and Cohn had essentially said, well, it was McCarthy that said, if you're so worried about communists, to Welch, then he implied you should look into your own law firm. And then he made the accusation that a young lawyer who worked for Welch was actually a communist. And in response to that, Welch made this statement, had this exchange that has become very famous.
We now drop this. We know he belongs to the Lawyers Guild. And Mr. Cole nods his head at me. I did you, I think, no personal injury, Mr. Cole. No, sir. I meant to do you no personal injury. And if I did, I beg your pardon. Let us not assassinate this lad further, Senator. You've done enough. Have you no sense of decency, sir? At long last, have you left no sense of decency?
Have you no sense of decency, sir? At long last, have you left no sense of decency? And a lot of the American public, by this time, having watched McCarthy every day for several weeks, agreed with that. They agreed with that assessment. He really came across as mean-spirited, paranoid, and not very likable if you listened to him for more than 5 or 10 seconds. And so this was a huge turning point, and he immediately lost public support, and people immediately turned against the attitude of the excesses of these witch hunts. And that was a powerful and impactful cultural thing, to the extent that ever since then, his name, Joseph McCarthy, or McCarthyism, is used to describe mass hysteria and paranoia and witch hunts, used very often. Although, in recent years, I've noticed that from some quarters, there have been efforts to present him in a more heroic light. That's not the light that he was in by the time these hearings were over. And in fact, due to the fact that he had made all these accusations with really no proof whatsoever and caused so much trouble, not only did the Senate stop looking into these various things that he'd had them looking into, they looked into him, and he wound up being censured by the United States Senate. After that, he was not that much in public demand anymore, and he died 3 years later. 1957, of I think complications with his liver as a result of heavy drinking. So that is the way that McCarthy fell. But there were still a few years left of the Red Scare, and the Cold War was still going to go on for, gosh, decades yet to come.